We have visiting us in the Anglicaanse Kerk in België this fortnight 6 ordinands, 6 trainee vicars from the Kerk van Engeland and in particular from the large theological seminary in Durham called Cranmer Hall. And it fell to me on Wednesday afternoon to explain to them the particularities of the Napoleonic Concordat. And so you can imagine on a warm summer's afternoon in a warm room in ETF, I could feel my own eyes getting heavy, let alone the eyes in front of me. But one of the, it's very, very bad luck for them, but one of the particularities of the Napoleonic Concordat as it applies to the recognized religions in Belgium is it gives me responsibility for the 4 Anglican almoezeniers in the Evangelissen, the prison chaplains. And so 3 of them are French-speaking, and so we have regular sessions in which we work through issues of theology and pastoral care as they interface with people who are in prison in this country. All sorts of statistics I could go into, and I won't, but one is rather interesting, given the people in front of me. 96% of prisoners in Belgium are men. Isn't that interesting? So I'll leave that one with you. 96% are men. So, and there's all sorts of reasons why that is the case, but isn't it interesting? So 2 of the prison chaplains over whom I am responsible are of Rwandan origin. And they have a very particular tradition in the Église Anglicane du Rwanda of biblical interpretation. And as they come to Belgium, and as they interface with Belgian traditions, they find that a really creative difference between what is experienced in Europe and what is experienced in Africa. And so I hit on a wonder text, for those of you who are able to communicate in France, a wonder text which has really helped us expose and expound the Bible from those 2 different cultural perspectives. And I have it in my hand, and it is by a French Reformed author called Antoine Nuis. He's a pasteur of the Église réformée de France, and it's called La lecture intrigante. And he provides a number of pastoral situations in which he sifts through the 3 basic possibilities for interpretation which strike him as reasonable arising from those pastoral situations. And I thought I'd discuss them tonight with reference to Jesus' parables. See, the thing about a parable is the Greek word means either a comparison or an illustration. I'm going to give you an example to illustrate, to picture something. Is that it's very hard to suck out of a parable a definite specific doctrine. And I'll come back to that point in a while. Because the first of the methods of biblical interpretation proposed by Antoine Nuis is literal. So take an example this week, and this is not a point against Jean. Jean and I are very good friends, okay? But I'm going to mention a certain American politician who's been in the news this week, a man called Jeff Sessions. I shall be honest and say he's not my favorite politician in the world, okay? And he even gave rise to what I think is the very best joke on the American comedy series Will and Grace. I'm not a great fan of Will and Grace, but the character I like, this probably reveals a lot about me, on Will and Grace. I don't like anyone except Karen Walker. And I think she's very, very funny. And one scene I remember recently is that Karen Walker is talking to Beverly Leslie, and he's weeping. And she says to him, "Oh, stop crying. It's like Jeff Sessions watching a black man vote." So there we are. Anyway, this week, Jeff Sessions has been in the news because he's been defending the current American administration's policy of taking immigrants who cross the Mexican border into America and separating adults from their children. When, quite obviously and reasonably, journalists quizzed him on this, he said, well, I'm going to quote Romans 13 and say that governments are instituted by God and are God-given, and it is correct to obey them. And that, of course, was used as a way of closing down the debate. Now, irrespective of whether you're in favour of Mr. Sessions' politics, that is an example of a literal approach, according to Antoine Nuis, of interpretation of the Bible, which instantly gives rise to all sorts of questions. So I, as an 18th century church historian, would immediately fire back, well, when William Wilberforce was debating in the British House of Commons the abolition of the slave trade, one of the very favourite passages of those who were in favour of the slave trade, who had economic interests in the Caribbean slave trade, was Romans 13. And this was used as a means of closing down and smothering a debate about the ethics of the slave trade. It can be used to justify anything, really. So that's one approach, which is literal. And Nuis, being a very open-minded scholar, a very noted scholar in France, doesn't necessarily disagree with it. He just says, be aware that there are risks attached to the literal interpretation of the Bible. It can lead you into all sorts of political cul-de-sacs. Just be aware of that. Now, normally, that standard, as it were, middle-of-the-road Anglican sermon contrasts Nuis's first example, literal, with the second example, which is historical critical. And so there you say, oh, no. Everything has to be subjected to the fine forensic lens of the Facultät Theologie KU Leuven, of the ETF Leuven, and we need to subject the passage to all sorts of checks and balances historically. And so you might say, according to the historical critical approach, well, we notice, alas, that the mustard seed is not the smallest of all seeds, and that the mustard tree is not the biggest of all trees. The baobab is bigger, and the giant redwood in America is bigger. If you delve into this passage in terms of the historical critical approach, there's a really fascinating debate, if you're a New Testament scholar, which I'm not, but even so it's quite fascinating, about verses 33 and 34. I'll just repeat them now. With many such parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as they were able to bear it. And then verse 34, he did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. And there's a huge debate in the literature about the difference between those two verses. And the standard historical critical reply is, oh, the first verse reflects Jesus' practice, and the second of those verses reflects Mark the evangelist's gloss on things, that he reinterprets Jesus' practice of teaching in parables in a way which privileges the inner circle of disciples and gives them all knowledge whilst keeping the ordinary people outside that knowledge. And there's a great debate about that. But rather interestingly, what Antoine Nuis says is the debate can't end there, because the risk of that type of debate is it becomes even drier and more desiccated than this sermon. That people think, oh, here's another lecture. Here's another analysis of Greek verbs or syntax. Here's another analysis of the ancient Near East, of Palestinian farming practices, or whatever it is. This tells me nothing about my life today. It tells me all about what Mark the evangelist might have eaten for breakfast. It doesn't tell me anything about how this text applies today. But again, Nuis doesn't criticize it. He says, no, in the arsenal, the hands of the Jewish or Christian person reading the scriptures, there is a literal approach, there is a historical critical approach, and he does rather push forward the third option, which he calls, interestingly, the rabbinic approach. And that reflects the fact that in the French Calvinist tradition, there is completely absent the sort of knee-jerk anti-Semitism which you might find in Martin Luther. So Calvin was immune from that. And so the French Reformed tradition has never had that sense of anti-Semitism. And, for example, it was Calvin who reintroduced, saying, the Ten Commandments from Exodus into the communion liturgy. And so it's a rather interesting nod in reference to the synagogue. And what he means by the rabbinic approach is that the text of the Bible is given to us by God. And that the text is an infinite resource of endless, accrued layers of interpretation. Because Nuis follows the rabbis, the Jewish leaders, in saying, once we say, I, Jack McDonald, or I, whoever it is, have a direct line to understanding and interpreting the Torah or any other part of the scriptures, that is a blasphemy. Because if we are monotheists, we will hold that only God understands his word. Only the mind of Christ understands the Torah and the rest of the Bible. And if I start saying, oh, look, here's the answer, I need to be very careful. But what I can do in the image of the medieval Jewish rabbis is add interpretations, as they did literally in manuscripts, round the text, building layer upon layer upon layer of interpretation. All of them provisional, because only God can interpret the Bible completely and fully, but nonetheless insightful, useful for today's world. And so in that light, in my conversations with my wonderful prison chaplains, we've had some really good conversations about various passages of the Bible using a sort of rabbinical method. What layer of interpretation are we putting on this passage, rather than saying, as it were, it says these words, end of story, or saying, as it were, oh, well, look at the history, look at the verbs, look at the syntax, isn't this interesting? And reducing it, in a way, to Caesar's Gallic War or something like that, just another text. But seeing the text as given by God to us with an invitation to interpret endlessly. And so in that light, I did a sort of rabbinical interpretation myself of these passages, and I came up with all sorts of ideas, which may or may not be true, because only God has access to the truth of the biblical text. And I had ideas like the following. Isn't it interesting that the sower doesn't do a lot? That the sower sows. But in fact, the work is not done by the sower. The sower, as Mark says, goes to sleep. And the work and the growth of the plant is someone else's responsibility, God's. And as I look at that passage as a 21st century Christian, it's not letting me off the hook and saying, please be even more idle than we know you are, Jack. But it's saying, no, in the end, it isn't your work. The evangelization of the world and God, the missio Dei, God's mission to the world, is God's work. It is the Spirit's work. It is a terrible arrogance to say, oh, we do evangelism. The Spirit does evangelism. We are called, in the passage's terms, to plant a seed. But the growth comes from elsewhere. And so that another idea I had was this contrast then between activity and passivity. Because the farmer does sow and the farmer does reap the harvest, but in the middle there's this great sort of passive state. The abundance of the harvest, the fact that out of these little miserable little seeds, an amazing fecund harvest is harvested, is a great bonus and boost to me as I read this passage. How would it apply in my own life? This sense of not despairing, that the work of the Spirit is happening all the time underneath, over and above whatever we do. And so in the end, I offer it to you. I'm not going to ask for responses now, but I wonder what we make as Christians hearing that Bible passage about the sower, about the mustard seed. What do we make of it? And the lesson which Antoine Nuis urges us to grasp in terms of the rabbinical interpretation is that your interpretations have an equal validity Again, one aspect of the French Reformed tradition is its extreme democracy. And so the idea that Jack, because he's a priest, has somehow a hotter line to the Almighty is just, well, it's a nonsense anyway, but it's certainly a nonsense from the French Reformed tradition. How do I know about it? I did work for 3 years in the French Reformed parish, and I've learned to love that tradition alongside my own Anglican tradition. But it's a wonderful democratic tradition whereby in a Bible study, all your ideas, in this room there'd be 30 or so ideas and layers of interpretation where we say, well, I think that what God is saying to me in this passage is this, or I think what God is saying to me in this passage is that. And they build up into this wonderful brocade and fabric of biblical interpretation, in which, in the end, the Bible, you see, becomes a living word, because it's surrounded by layer upon layer upon layer of personal, lived interpretation. I have no doubt, given the news I relayed at the beginning of this service about my current illness, that will affect, as I was saying to Annie before the service, how I receive the parables of Jesus about healing. Of course, that will become another layer in my appreciation and my reception of the word. And so just to summarize, I think Antoine Nuis offers us, not just the Anglican prison chaplains in Belgium, but all of us, a very serviceable matrix for how to approach the 66 books of the Bible. We have 3 broad options. We can go for a literal approach, and that has its own validity according to whether it works or not. We can have a historical critical approach, which has its own validity in certain circumstances, most particularly in the textual analysis and in the faculty of theology. And we have a rabbinical approach, which is, for Nuis anyway, the most serviceable, the most useful, the one which gives us most honor as entities made in God's image and redeemed by Christ and living in the Spirit, able to receive the text and add our own layer of interpretation, and thus to see the Word of God grow in each one of us. Amen.